What is emotional intimacy and how do we get it? Intimacy requires for you to know thyself. Learn why intimacy begins with self-awareness. And on our green tips, building a green home. Next on Living Smart.
Michele has been a psychotherapist for the past 37 years. One of her specialties is the art of intimacy. A dancer before pursuing her career as a psychotherapist, she understands the mind-body connection and that fulfilling one's heart's desires means daily practice to strengthen and stretch our capacities for self-awareness. She believes once we're comfortable in our own skin, then we can truly be with one another in an unguarded or intimate way. Michele, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And why is it that we have to be self-aware to become intimate with others?
To live life, one has to become self-aware, and intimacy is an intricate part of living our daily lives.
Why is it, though? Why is it so important that, how do we get to that point where we're self-aware or conscious, I guess?
Well, we have to know our roots, where we came from, what our beliefs are, what our visions are for the future, what our sense of self is, what our sense of other is, where we came from, who we came from.
Very good. So your family life, your background. What does intimacy require besides self-awareness?
It requires that we be unguarded in the way in which we interact with the people we love.
So vulnerable in a way? Would that mean being vulnerable?
It would absolutely mean being vulnerable. Without being vulnerable, you cannot be intimate.
Why is that?
Because being vulnerable brings us back down to our core sense of being, and we can be real and we can be trusting in that place.
Now, we tend to think of intimacy as sexual intimacy, but can you be sexually intimate without being emotionally intimate, let's say?
Yes, you can. You can be sexually intimate. You can be emotionally intimate.
And not be sexually intimate.
And not be sexually intimate.
That's interesting. So there are different types of intimacy.
Very much so.
Tell me.
There's emotional intimacy, there's sexual intimacy, there's intellectual intimacy, there's spiritual intimacy.
Why did you choose to teach this? I know you used to be a dancer. Why intimacy? You could have picked anything.
Well, the work I do as a psychotherapist is probably the most intimate kind of relationship one could have without having a sexual relationship with a person.
Because you really get to know the core of the person.
Well,
you have to help them, right?
The kind of work that I do deals with both unconscious contents as well as the conscious life. And in order to dig deeper into the unconscious, what's below the surface, you have to be able to be intimate.
And vulnerable.
And very vulnerable.
Tell me about the basic steps to reach intimacy. Where do you start? Besides self-awareness, number one.
There are not really any formulated steps.
Right.
It has to start with one's ability to want to know oneself and another more. And with that, you become vulnerable and you begin a conversation. My job is to help someone find out where their strengths are and where their limitations are in being able to relate to another person and to move from their strengths rather than their limitations and build intimacy from there.
Do you need certain skills to be intimate?
I think you need to have the skill of being comfortable, as you said in the introduction, in your own skin and bones, and without that, nothing else can happen.
What about empathy and understanding and compassion? Are those qualities that you need, or could you do without them? To be intimate with someone.
To be intimate with someone, you cannot be without empathy.
Because understanding of what the other person's going through.
Correct.
And compassion. Why is compassion so important?
Because it allows you, when your partner or yourself are vulnerable, it allows you to keep your heart open and your mind open and your whole being open in order to receive them.
You say sexuality gains power through the senses. Touch, smell, feel, hear, whatever. And you also say that that is very important for intimacy. Tell me about that, because then we're talking not only our moral and spiritual, but we're also talking about our physical.
Well, intimacy is also a biological need. It is what keeps humanity growing as the populations have grown, as we've seen. And intimacy requires that we be very carefully in touch with our instincts, and those are our senses of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and tasting. And all of those are our primary birthright, and they tell much, much more actually in the areas of intimacy than often words do.
When you see people, and you're always trying to help people regain their intimacy, what are the most common obstacles that you see in people trying to gain that intimacy?
I would say anger and fear are probably the two most powerful emotions that keep people from being intimate. Fear because they're afraid of being left and lost and not understood. Fear perhaps of physical hurt to them, and certainly emotional hurt to them. Anxiety and anger, if someone has hurt them, then they're not going to be willing to open up to you, to another person. And if they do open up, it opens up in anger instead of in love. And they're defending against actually feeling close to somebody else because they're afraid they're going to be hurt again, the same way they were hurt originally.
And is it hard? Let's say you had a great marriage, you were intimate for a long time, and then, life gets in the way of your kids, whatever. Stress, probably a killer of intimacy. How do you help them get that back? Get the groove back, I would say.
First, when I work with a couple, I ask them individually what they want for themselves, what they want for the marriage. Well, as a couple, I'll ask them each individually what you want, right? And I'll do that in the first interview. And in the second interview, I usually like to see each part of the couple individually to find out more about their history, their personal history, family of origin, and their experiences in other relationships as well as in the one they have now, and where they feel the roadblocks are.
Are there differences how men and women view intimacy?
Yes, men typically in our culture in modern day tend to equate intimacy with having sexual intercourse. Women certainly think of it as having sexual intercourse, but much, much more having a human relationship with somebody else.
What are the pre-verbal communications or feelings related to intimacy? Because we assume that you have to be verbal, but there's so much communication that does not happen verbally.
The verbal has to do with how someone looks at you, how someone hears you, how someone approaches you. Our personal space is the space that goes from the tip of our fingertips to our body core and center. And some people cannot let anyone into their personal space. So how someone approaches you and enters into your personal space affects how you will respond to them in particular in intimate matters.
So everybody's going to be different?
Everybody's going to be different.
Is there a right or wrong type of intimacy?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Some people don't have the capacity, let's say, for real emotional intimacy, but they have the capacity for intellectual intimacy.
Can that be learned, though? Can you learn to be emotionally intimate? Can you take classes on emotional intimacy?
I believe you can, but some people are so far over on the spectrum of intellectualization that it's very, very hard for them.
Okay.
Not impossible, but hard.
If I want to have kids that I want to have a great ability to be intimate with others. And I'm not just talking sexual, obviously. I'm talking of all different types of intimacy, which probably brings us happiness. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this. What is a healthy way to teach our children intimacy?
Well, the first way is that we relate in a real way to our children when they're born. We attempt to be very close and tender, speak in a loving voice instead of a voice of hatred. Looking at them with loving eyes instead of what some people call the eyes of death. And all of that affects whether our children will be comfortable in being intimate. And once certainly they reach school age, they become to be socialized. So many of our children today are brought up in daycare situations. And they have to learn socialization much, much earlier than they used to.
Don't we have a lot of confused adolescents who think sexual intimacy is actual intimacy?
Absolutely, we do.
Why is that happening, and how do we work with that?
I believe that's a cultural phenomena that's happening, and it's not just for adults. It's for adolescents. It's for adults as well. Culturally, right now, because of our confusion about what it means to be still and to be quiet, to have free time, to think, to have time for spontaneity and creativity, our culture does not support that. Our culture supports doing many things at the same time, rapidly, with immediate gratification. And our children today can't tolerate not having something come to them immediately. And sexual gratification is an immediate physical gratification that makes them feel better. And the more it makes them feel better, the more they want it. But they don't have the emotional skills to deal with the intensity of those sexual feelings.
And it's very short term.
Very short term.
Do you see that hurts them in the long run to become intimate eventually?
Well, it can and it can't. It depends. Some people will stop growing emotionally in adolescence, and they grow to be 30, 40, 50, and they still are functioning by adolescent values,
right.
And they haven't caught up with their own age.
Is one of the challenges or the obstacles to intimacy projecting other or past relationships that you're bringing onto the new relationship?
Well, that has to do with the past question you asked me about what is how does our personal history, is self-knowledge a part of intimacy? And without knowing where we came from, what our values were, what our assumptions are, and usually they're unknown, are about what it means to be a girlfriend or boyfriend, what it means to be a fiancé, or what it means to be a husband or wife, or even what it means to be a divorced husband or wife. Mm-hmm. We all have basic assumptions about those, usually that we don't even know we have, and we act upon them. Mm-hmm. Part of the job when someone goes through a loss, either through marriage or death or divorce, is to help them become reacquainted with what their original beliefs were and values were, and to see whether or not they still want to live by those values or whether they've outgrown them.
Right, right. Now, self-absorption seems to be the illness of our times, and narcissism. Can we actually reach intimacy if we are narcissistic or we're self-absorbed?
I think we can to a limit, and it usually will stop at the point where revelation of inner needs and vulnerabilities come into the picture. Mm-hmm. And that usually is right away and continues throughout a relationship.
For you, what seems to work with couples that have had a trouble for a while in becoming intimate? And again, I'm not just talking sexual. Mm-hmm. What seems to work in trying to help them get it back?
Well, what I'd like to do, again, is to find out what their relationship history has been about, what their personal history has been about, what wounds they've swallowed and taken in and have never been processed or understood or integrated, and to find out what those points are. And there's no formula for it that I use. I really have to listen to
every case is different.
Well, I have to listen to what they're telling me. Mm-hmm. And from that, a story begins to unfold. And I remain curious, so I continue to ask questions.
How important is appreciation in maintaining intimacy?
Appreciation, valuing, and for and foremost, I think respect for oneself and the other, and the ability to be compassionate to your partner and for the conditions of life. Mm-hmm. And without that, there's a lot of hostility that comes up between two people.
Well, it seems like stress. Stress is the biggest killer of intimacy.
Well, living our lives the way we do in our culture.
The way we do, which is every day, stress.
Every day.
You say that to be intimate, you should maintain a sense of mystery and wonder. Mm-hmm. Why is that? I don't understand that.
Well, the part of life that's mysterious is the part that really is not known consciously by a person. And so it ties in with one's curiosity, and it also ties in with one's spiritual values and beliefs. and being curious about yourself and your spouse or your partner.
Okay. Curiosity, very important and fun anyway.
Very important.
Right.
You have to laugh.
Right. Curiosity, and also you talk about sacredness, that we need to honor the sacredness in each other. Tell me, what does that mean?
Well, to me it means that first and foremost, we have to hold a respectful attitude toward our inner life. We have an inner life and an outer life. The outer life is what we live every day. The inner life are the thoughts, feelings, beliefs, things that we only get glimpses of through our dreams and our fantasies. And our task is to bring all of that, as much of that, not all of it, we can't ever bring all of it. It's a bottomless pit. But to bring as much of that up into our conscious awareness so we have it as a tool for living.
You used to be a dancer. Is there a dance of intimacy or a choreography to intimacy?
Well, yes, I actually see it that way. I watch very carefully where a couple sits on the sofa or on chairs, whether they're leaning toward their partner or away from their partner, whether they're turning their head away from the partner or looking at them, whether they turn their back to them or to me. Whether it's individual therapy or not, all of that nonverbal language tells me a lot.
Well, I would think then the dancer is great for intimacy then. Because you're kind of...
Literally dancing you're talking about. Yes, it would be. It absolutely would be.
I would think it'd be a good thing,
well,
right?
It certainly could be a step in.
Right, a step in the right direction.
One of the partners is really afraid to, quote-unquote, look like a fool because they can't dance.
Now, why is it so difficult for people, some people become intimate?
Because they're afraid.
They've been hurt before, or?
Probably been very hurt, and probably it was a very early wound.
Do expectations kill intimacy?
Absolutely, because expectations imply something that we call in Jungian psychology projection. And projection is seeing something out there in another person or another place that really is all about them, but the person projecting that thing out there is really a part of themselves, and they don't know it.
And projection tends to ruin things, because when you project, you're bringing things from the past, correct?
Bringing things from the past.
And also expectations.
And also the unknown aspects of yourself, not necessarily even from the past, just parts of yourself you just don't have a clue about.
How? I'm sorry.
An example could be walking into a room and you've never spoken to the person, seen them before, or have had any interaction with them, and you either immediately hate them or you immediately love them, and you don't have a clue why.
That's
you
have
projection.
To be curious about that. Trust and respect, very important for intimacy.
They're building blocks. Basic trust, feeling safe and feeling loved are the two primary emotions that infants, human beings, newly born, need in order to grow and to be able to eventually learn how to think and use their frontal cortex for thinking. And without it, we cannot feel safe enough in our environment, whatever that is, in order to be spontaneous and alive and real. We often put in front of people what is called the false self, the self that we think gets us through life, rather than what our really internal life is. And so that creates confusion, not only, let's say, in you, but in the person themselves, because what they're thinking, what they're feeling, what they're believing, and what they're living are four different things.
Wow, so they're not being authentic.
Not at all.
Very difficult, I would think, to be intimate if you're not living an authentic life.
It is a roadblock.
There are basic steps to intimacy sometimes. One of the things that I notice is certain cultures tend to look more intimate than others. Let's say you go to Europe and certain countries where people hug and kiss and, you know, and other ones where they don't, because maybe it's up in the north and it's too cold. You know, Italy, Sweden, for example. Is that important? Touch, hugging?
It's the basic precept
kissing.
of life. It's where we begin when we see a newborn life. All we want to do is hug and kiss that little baby and smell it and soothe it. That's the same kinds of things that we want to do in sexual intimacy as well as emotional intimacy. We need it. We never outgrow that.
What is it that you, when you were dancing, when you started practicing psychotherapy, what was it about the subject of intimacy that you thought, maybe this is where I need to go to deal with all the other issues that my clients have problems with?
Well, when I first started out in my career, I remembered feeling as a child and remembering, I grew up in New York City, going to the subway stations and watching people, just observing how they moved. And I began to notice everybody had their own way of moving about in the world. And I became very curious about what that meant in terms of who they were as people and what it meant about them emotionally. And that really became a driving force. It pulled me. I became more and more curious about it, and I began to forge a career in dance movement therapy and the expressive arts therapies, which then led me to psychoanalytic and analytic psychology.
So the knowledge of your being able to be in touch with your body, movement, helped you figure out.
It drove me. I saw a connection that I didn't understand between how people express themselves. Here I am using my arms, which is typical of me to do that. Right.
Oh, do you?
Oh, yeah, I use them all the time. It's part of who I am.
Right.
It would be considered an idiosyncratic gesture on my part. This is how I do this gesture. Nobody else does it quite that way, and it's connected to how I'm feeling.
Could you say that people who tend to be more intimate are happier than people who are not?
I think they're happier, and I think they're more fulfilled.
Why do you think that is?
Because they're getting their human needs met.
So by practicing,
through themselves,
right,
and with another.
Okay, so by practicing intimacy, whether it's intellectual, emotional, physical, it's more of a human nature.
It's more of the human connection, understanding yourself in humanity and understanding the human dilemma.
Have you found that there's some people who are way more, way better in certain types of intimacy than others, or people who are generally intimate in one way, they're just as intimate in all the other ways?
There are some people who are gifted and lucky enough to be gifted in having intimacy on all levels. Most people do not. Some people only have it on an intellectual level. Some people will have it on an intellectual and spiritual level. Some people will have it on an emotional level only. And some people will have it in all four areas.
Do you find it's becoming harder for Americans in general to be more intimate over time because of the way we live our lives, where we're not getting enough sleep, or we're stressed out, or we're working too hard?
I think it's very hard for couples to find time today to be quiet enough that they can really hear one another and be seen by one another.
And technology, does that get in the way of intimacy?
Everything gets in the way of intimacy, including technology.
Yeah, and that's the way we live ourselves these times. How do you know you're living smart?
I know I'm living smart because my insides and my outsides feel in harmony. And I love the whole process. I talk about my life as like a garden, and that I treat my life as if it were a beautiful garden, and giving a garden all the things that it needs. And with that, I know I'm living smart.
Thank you very much. I love that garden. And thank you for joining us. And now on our green tips, the steps to building a greenhouse with LEED certified homeowner David Ron. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. He first explains the advantages of a sealed attic.
A sealed attic means that this attic has no outside ventilation. In other words, it's an extension of the rest of our house. It's air-conditioned space. Whereas most attics might be 120, 130 degrees, particularly during the summer, this attic will only be 5 degrees warmer than what our house is, so maybe 77, 80 degrees. And the benefit of that is that the AC and the vents are able to operate in that cooler temperature, and you don't have to run the AC as hard to be able to get cold temperatures inside your house. So you save energy by utilizing your air conditioning system at a much more efficient rate. To be able to build a sealed attic, whether it be new construction or renovation, you should talk to your architect, experienced builders in the area. They certainly will know about this kind of construction. One of the interesting features about it is there's no insulation on the floor of the attic. All the insulation is up underneath the eaves. And in essence, you're just building another room to the house. A sealed attic is part of your overall green building strategy for two reasons. One, to help you save on your utilities, and two, it allows you to size down your AC and heating units because they don't have to work as hard in your attic.
To learn more about green tips and intimacy, go to our website. There you'll also find a complete resource list. And you can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart. I'm Patricia Gross. Have a sustainable week.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.